Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, and Matt Dathan, Home Affairs Editor of The Times. Tomorrow's front pages. Let's start with the Mail. Britain faces a winter of woe, proclaims the paper, as it says millions of people may be hit with bill increases of more than £400, and Tesco and farmers' leaders warn of panic buying. But The Guardian reports that gas firms may face a windfall tax as the energy crisis is set to hit 800,000 households as two more suppliers collapse. The Eye says up to 7 million households that get gas from vulnerable energy firms are facing a hike in bills. The fast lane to prison is how the Metro headlines the High Court injunction that could mean 2-year prison sentences for climate change protesters who continue blocking the M25 motorway by staging sit-down protests. As Boris Johnson is pictured walking through the US Capitol in Washington, the FT notes that President Biden makes a peace offering to France's President Macron over the Australia-UK-US pact, which led to outrage in Paris at a nuclear submarine contract being cancelled. The Telegraph's take is that Mr Johnson and Mr Biden are astonished at Emmanuel Macron as the Prime Minister tells the President of France to get a grip. He actually said some of that in French, but I'm not going to paraphrase the franglais there. Let us begin, and we're going to keep things right back in this country, starting with the Daily Mail. Britain faces winter of woe, millions to be hit by fuel bills shock. Tesco and farm chiefs warn of panic buying. Sonia Sodha, winter of discontent?
It does definitely look like it's going to be a really grim autumn and winter, particularly for low-paid parents. And there's a few things that are sort of coming together to create this. So first of all, there is rising fuel prices. Families face really significant increase in their fuel costs over the next year. Second, there is the government's tax credit cut. So families have faced a decade of tax credit cuts, and there was an uplift of £20 given in the context of those cuts to help families survive through the pandemic. The government is now proposing to take that away. That's going to hit low-income, low-paid parents to the tune of £1,000 a year. And then lastly, food prices are forecast to go up as well. And we've got the Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimating that the typical low-income family is going to be losing £1,750 a year. That's almost £2,000 a year worse off by next April. These are huge amounts, and it's going to be a massive struggle for parents who are already struggling to keep their kids warm and fed. And I really think we need to sort of take a step back and look at what's causing this. I think it's first of all the government's cuts to support for low-income families, but also another big problem we've got in this country are huge housing costs. We've got the highest rents in Europe. They are a massive chunk of household bills, and that's one of the reasons why when food prices go up or energy prices go up, that places so much pressure on household budgets.
Matt Dathan from The Times, this isn't just a doorstep issue. I mean, this is about how someone's household is able to run or not.
Yes, that's right. And what really struck me from the Daily Mail front page is the quote from Tesco boss, who said that the pictures we've been seeing on our newspapers and TV screens over the last few days of the empty shelves, those pictures will be 10 times worse by Christmas, and warned of panic buying basically on steroids compared to what we've seen last year. So we thought last winter was bad with the winter lockdown, the cancellation of Christmas. But this year we're facing a real eventuality and a real prospect of Christmas being cancelled in terms of the food on our table.
It's quite astonishing then to think that the winter of 2020, the one we just had, we might look back on with nostalgia at one point compared to what's coming up. Let's look at the Guardian newspaper, which continues to look at the energy crisis. Gas firms may face windfall tax as energy crisis hits more households. Sonia Sodha from The Observer, you've illustrated those potential costs to families, £1,750 as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimated. Now this idea gas firms may face the windfall tax.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see this proposal on the table. I think, this is a week where some of the smaller energy companies are going bust, but we know that historically energy companies, particularly the big six, have made huge profits in the UK, and they tend to benefit when prices go up. But actually, when the sort of retail, the wholesale cost of energy goes down, they don't reduce prices, so they're able to sort of bank those extra profits. So I think a windfall tax on energy companies is a really interesting proposal, and it's worth looking at. But that alone is not going to get us out of this cost of living crisis. I think in order to do that, we need to, it comes back to what I was saying before. It's you know, energy costs is one part of the solution, but there has to be a massive political focus on housing costs. It's just unacceptable that that people face the highest rents in Europe in this country, and it makes living in this country unsustainable if you're working in a minimum wage job and you've got kids. There's got to be a big focus on that. And then we've got to ask questions about why low-paid parents, some of them have lost thousands of pounds a year over the last decade as a result of cuts from the government to tax credits, to support with childcare. And you know, these are not decisions. These decisions are political choices. They've happened at the same time as the government has delivered quite expensive income tax cuts that have predominantly gone to more affluent households. There's been a redistribution from poor families with children to more affluent households. So I think energy prices are a big part of it, but we've got to look at housing, and we've got to look at financial support for low-paid parents too.
Matt, let's also look at those gas firms. Kwasi Kwarteng was saying in the Commons he's not going to reward failure, that these endless number of firms which are in trouble are just going to be allowed to go bust.
Yeah, that's right. We've already seen now with today's news that 1.5 million customers are having to be transferred to other suppliers. So 1 in 20 customers so far, and so far it's only the smaller companies. It shows you, I guess, the legacy of the competition with so many energy companies. About 39 are left, I think, around about that, competing in the market. The energy price cap is set at 1,277, and as you saw the Mail just now, customers on the cheapest tariffs on other these cheaper firms, these firms have gone bust. They're going to face bills of rises of up to £400 because those smaller firms were offering such good deals, £400 below the energy cap. So you can kind of understand the reasons for some of the firms to argue for the cap to be increased so they can cover the cost of the wholesale costs, the wholesale prices of gas. But as Sonia was saying, that's all going to feed through into higher household bills, because we all need gas to heat our homes in winter.
Let's have a quick look at UK politics. In the Guardian newspaper again, Starmer lays down roadmap to the centre. Sonia Sodha, the centre was good for Clinton and Blair. It's not been so good, as the Americans would say, for dead armadillos. How's Starmer going to fare in the centre?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's quite hard to say. I mean, I think the first thing to say, so we're going into Labour Party conference next week. So this is, you know, one of the big set piece things in the run up to it that the Labour leader is doing. It's quite an unusual choice of medium in some way for a politician, an 11,500 words essay that's published with the Fabian Society. I have to confess, it's only just been released this evening, so I haven't had time to sit down.
Shock! Have you not read it?
That'll be part of my homework for the rest of the But so, you know, but the newspapers are reporting that the Labour Party itself are sort of positioning it as a move to the centre. I think, you know, we can sometimes end up talking, you know, in quite sort of broad brush terms, you know, the left, the centre, the right in politics. It doesn't really mean a lot to people. And so what I'll be interested to see is what is the Labour leader saying in terms of what might be a pitch to people who didn't vote Labour in 2019. And I was reading some really interesting analysis today about the sorts of voters that Labour needs to win over if they're going to win the next general election. And Labour can't get away from the fact that they need to win over some people who switched to the Conservatives in 2019. So right. I think it's going to be interesting. I haven't done it yet, but I think it will be interesting to evaluate this very long essay with some new policy ideas in it, by the sounds of things, with that in mind.
You know, we do have 40 minutes between this press review and the next one, which gives you time to read 11,000 word essay. We will get back to you on that. Matt Dathan from The Times. We're going to move to our next story. In the Metro newspaper, simply, fast lane to prison, all yours.
Yeah, that's right. This is the news that the government has successfully been granted an interim injunction to ban Insulate Britain protesters from taking part in further demonstrations blocking the motorways, the M25. But and they argue that this will, or they say that this will, protesters will face up to 2 years in prison. Basically, the key problem here was police previously did not have the power to detain individuals for more than 24 hours under the existing legislation that they had to arrest these. There were more than 270 people have been arrested in the last 10 days, but they've been able to return to the site of protests because police can only detain them for 24 hours. But if you arrest someone with an offence that carries a prison sentence, which contempt of court, of course, does, then you can detain them on remand, so preventing them from returning to the site of protests. However, there are big holes in this sort of interim injunction. It only applies to the M25, and Insulate Britain have already said they're going to move to other motorways. The M40 and the M4, I think, are in their sights, we hear. And today we saw them mocking Priti Patel by staging a protest outside the Home Office and burning the papers of that very injunction.
That's very interesting. I didn't know you might need a separate injunction for each separate motorway. We will move on now to international politics. Let's look at the Daily Mail. And on the front page there, on the bottom, Boris likens Macron to a jilted lover. Le bust up. They've chosen that as a masculine. It is franglais again, and it is indicative of that rather tetchy relationship between Britain and the United States on the one hand and France on the other hand, Sonia.
That's right, and I think the Daily Mail captures, I guess, what could politely be termed the Boris Johnson approach to diplomacy quite well here. And I think there's a very stark contrast between Boris Johnson's reaction to the fact that France felt quite put out by this announcement of cooperation between the UK, Australia and the US, and Joe Biden's reaction. And Boris Johnson's, I think we're going to come on to Joe Biden's reaction in a minute, but Boris Johnson's reaction was sort of characterised by his sort of typical kind of bombast, using franglais to tell the French to, give him a break, and, which I think is probably a questionable approach to sort of calming the waters after France has made it clear that they did feel very left out of this deal and quite put out not to have advance notice. And I do think that, set in the wider context, this is troubling in the sense that France is such an important ally for the UK. We may have left the EU, but they're one of our closest neighbours. We have to work very closely in terms of, for example, the channel crossings and irregular migration and asylum seekers coming to the UK. We also, have significant strategic interests in the rest of Europe, and it does seem that Boris Johnson is saying, right, post-Brexit Britain, we can forget about Europe now, it's all about the US. We've seen the dangers of that in the last couple of days with his hopes getting dashed on a US trade deal, and this doesn't seem to me to be a very wise approach to diplomacy when France is such a strategically important ally to us.
Matt, the interesting thing about this when we look at the Mail newspaper is that France took great pains to say in recent days this really wasn't much to do with the UK. The UK was just a vassal clinging on to America and was just a passenger, therefore there was no particular need even to withdraw the French ambassador to the UK. Yeah,
that's right. It's very interesting that they withdrew their Australian and US ambassador, but not Britain's. I think it's sort of kind of mocking Britain, saying, well, you're not really that important anymore, you're a minor player. Yeah, you're turning Boris Johnson's own words against him during that Brexit debate by calling him a vassal state to the US. I think relations between France and the UK have completely broken down, as Sonia was saying, over several other issues. And I completely agree, Sonia. It's really interesting the contrast to which the US, the White House, the current White House, and Downing Street is responding to this sort of diplomatic fallout. You see France on one hand agreeing to return their ambassadors to Washington. Biden, I think, is going to visit Paris next month. And they put out a joint statement. We haven't seen any joint statements between the UK and France in recent times, saying basically the situation could have benefited from open consultations on matters of strategic interest to France. So Biden there is very clearly slightly regretting that they sort of shut out France and didn't include them in the discussions last week.
We're going to look at the Financial Times, which continues another angle to this story on the front page. Biden makes peace offering to Macron after AUKUS pact clash with a picture of Boris Johnson there walking through the halls of the capital. Sonia Sodha, you were previewing, talking about Joe Biden just now.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with what Matt just said. It seems like there's been a concerted diplomatic push from the White House to sort of try and smooth the waters with France. I think this joint statement is very significant, and I think it really contrasts with the sort of breakdown in relations between the UK and France. And I think it's significant that both leaders have sort of put out this statement saying, well, this could have been handled better, which is quite a significant concession from the US, I think. And it contrasts to Boris Johnson sort of saying, well, you know, everyone, when you've got a difficult conversation to have with a mate, everyone leaves it till the last minute, don't they? I mean, that generally isn't the approach with international relations and diplomacy. And I think this statement from, joint statement from Macron and Biden does acknowledge that.
We're going to move to our final story now in the Daily Telegraph. Below, a picture of Boris Johnson meeting a bust of Winston Churchill. I have to point out a bit of trivia nerddom here. This is Winston Churchill there, who was the first ever honorary citizen of the United States. His bust looking down at Boris Johnson, the first ever British Prime Minister to renounce US citizenship. I've been very proud of that bit of trivia. But we're going to look at something else. Roald Dahl, who was Norwegian born, then British, worked in America. His family is to share £500 million in a Netflix deal. Matt Dathan, I know that you have something to say about this subject, because when you held up your paper just now, I could see the notes on the other side which talked about Roald Dahl. All yours.
I'm really excited because Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was one of my favourite books as a child, so I'm looking forward to what Netflix can make that into. It's really interesting. I mean, there's not much detail in the Telegraph, but it said that Netflix is going to develop a gaming series of Roald Dahl books as well. So I'm fascinated by that, although I'm not a gamer. But when it comes to Roald Dahl books, maybe I'll be converted. But what's really interesting is that £500 million this deal is worth. And just in 2019, the family earned just £26 million from its books. So you can see the scale of this deal for the family.
Sonia Sodha, which Roald Dahl books do you want to be made into a 10-part mini-series, or, as Matt was saying there, into a video game?
Gosh, well, there were so many Roald Dahl books I loved as a kid. I actually really loved George's Marvellous Medicine.
Yeah, that was
one of the lesser sort of known ones in terms of its treatment, in terms of films and stuff, but I just loved reading the first bit where George is making all that medicine. And then I really loved Danny, the Champion of the World as well, actually. And I think a really good film was made of that in the 80s, but it'd be great to see an update of that.
It would. Sonia Sodha from The Observer, Matt Dathan from The Times, thank you to you both so much. I'll see you in a bit. That's it for the papers this hour. Sonia and Mim will be back in about 40 minutes. Do stay with us then. Bye.